I can still hear the sound of the iron bars slamming shut behind me, like I'm trapped inside my own head. The cold echo reverberating through the stone corridors of HMP Shepton Mallet, the oldest prison still in operation in the world, located in Somerset, England. Founded in 1610, its stone walls carry centuries of misery. But the truth is much older than any official record. That's something I learned the hard way. At first, it seemed like just another prison, a place to keep dangerous men away from the rest of society. But there was something different about Shepton Mallet. Something I couldn't see, but I felt the moment I stepped inside. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the very bricks were soaked in despair. And one thing that bothered me from the start, the silence. A place like this, packed with criminals, should be loud, chaotic. But instead, the prison was too quiet, as if it were listening. That first night, I couldn't sleep. Maybe it was the discomfort of the cell, or maybe it was something deeper, but my eyes wouldn't close. In the silence, I could swear I heard soft footsteps in the corridors, like someone pacing back and forth. But there was no one, just me, my cellmate Felix, a gaunt old man with hollow eyes, and that damned darkness. Over the next few days, I heard whispers, muffled voices that seemed to seep from the walls, echoing through the aging stone. At first, I thought it was the other prisoners, speaking in hushed tones, planning something. But then I realized the words weren't in English. It wasn't a language I knew. It was ancient, guttural, and angry. Felix told me it was the curse of the prison, the result of a massacre that happened centuries ago, when the place wasn't even called a prison and served as a fortress during England's civil revolts. Now, I know what you're thinking. Massacre, curse, sounds like some kind of tall tale, right? I thought the same. But Felix was dead serious, and after a while, so was I. Many years ago, before laws, before codes, Shepton Mallet was a place of chaos. A rebellion broke up among the prisoners who, after years of mistreatment, decided to take control. They were led by a man named Aldrich. Every prisoner who hears this story makes the sign of the cross when mentioning his name. Aldrich, it seems, was no ordinary prisoner. They say he came from a faraway place, brought here as a prisoner of war, not for common crimes. Aldrich had practiced rituals, old magic. He spoke of pacts with forces beyond human comprehension, and over the years he was imprisoned, he attracted followers. The guards, of course, never took the stories circulating among the cells seriously until it was too late. The rebellion was swift, brutal. Prisoners turned on guards with uncontrollable violence. However, when the prisoners finally took control, that's when things got strange. Aldrich led them to the deepest dungeons of the prison, where, according to legend, he conducted a ritual. They said he was trying to unleash something, a spirit or an entity trapped within the very foundations of the prison, something that had existed long before Shepton Mallet. What happened after that is hazy, but all the prisoners involved in the ritual vanished. They simply disappeared. Their bodies were never found, and since that day, the walls started to talk, to whisper. Aldrich, they say, unleashed something ancient, something hungry, and from that day on, no one inside those walls was ever the same again. As for me, my curiosity led me to explore the tunnels. I'm not exactly a prudent man. I've always been the type that, when I see a closed door, I feel an almost uncontrollable compulsion to open it. And that's exactly what I did. During my time working in prison maintenance, I found a passage that went deeper than any I'd ever seen. And of course, I followed it. The deeper I went, the stronger the smell of decay and dampness became. The air grew heavier, almost suffocating. And the voices in the walls seemed to follow me. Eventually, I reached a locked room with a rusty iron door, something that seemed forgotten by time. I pushed the door open, and there it was. A chair, right in the center of a circle of symbols carved into the floor. They pulsed, almost as if they were alive, absorbing the light from the torch I held. I felt the air grow cold suddenly, and when I turned, there he was. A man, or what used to be a man, draped in a dark cloak, his face obscured by a hood that only revealed his eyes, empty and pale as the moon. He said nothing, but I knew what he wanted. Aldrich. Or, at least, what was left of him. Aldrich, the liberator of monsters, now imprisoned by his own creation. I backed away, not out of fear, well, maybe a little out of fear, but because I knew that place was wrong. The voices intensified, and the room began to shake. The symbols on the floor glowed with a cold light, and the walls seemed to close in around me. An invisible force started to pull me toward that chair, as if the shadows themselves were trying to drag me into Aldrich's unfinished ritual. But I wasn't willing to pay the price. With one last push, I broke free from the force pulling me in. I ran, stumbling over loose stones as the voices whispered my name, begging me to stay. They screamed, laughed, calling me a coward. And maybe I was. But one thing was for sure, I was still breathing, and those the walls had swallowed would never see the light of day again. I scrambled up the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. When I reached my cell, Felix was lying on his bed, motionless, but not like he was asleep. It was as if the walls had drained everything from him. He was no longer a man, just a shell, empty. I knew I didn't have much time. That thing down there was awake, and it was hungry. In the dead of night, I prepared to escape. The plan didn't matter anymore. It was now, or, well, you get the idea. The maintenance room window was my only shot, but the hallway leading to it felt like an endless tunnel of shadows. I could feel its presence, Aldrich's, or whatever he had unleashed. I pressed forward, my heart beating like a drum, sweat dripping down my back. When I finally reached the room, the window was there my way out, but the shadows moved, crawling along the walls. I felt invisible hands grab at me, fingers cold as ice closing around my ankles, pulling me back. With a shout, I fought. I don't know where I found the strength, but I broke free. I climbed through the window with everything I had, feeling the shadows stretch, trying to pull me back. The wind outside was like a cold blade, cutting my face as I fell onto the stone ground. When I got up, I looked back one last time. The shadows, they were there at the window, watching, but they couldn't reach me. I was outside. I was free.
I shouldn't have been there, but when the invitation arrived, something inside me said I had to accept. An exclusive gathering for selected guests only, the heavy, elegant paper read, the embossed gold lettering indicated an address in Newport, Rhode Island, a historic city known for its mansions and high society parties. I felt a mix of curiosity and anxiety, and the thought of mingling with the elite for one night drew me in like a magnet. I arrived as night fell. The mansion was one of those grand structures that seemed to have been plucked straight out of the 19th century. The trees swayed gently in the wind, and the sound of the Atlantic waves crashing against the rocky shore in the distance was almost comforting. I walked through the ornate iron gate, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The rusty sign above read Carrington Estate in faded letters. It looked like the kind of place that had seen its share of dark secrets. Inside, a silent butler indicated that I should leave my phone in a box by the entrance. Security protocols, he whispered. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but I complied. The main hall was opulent, covered in ancient tapestries and furnished with luxurious leather sofas. The other guests, about 10 in total, were already there, holding glasses of wine and whispering to one another. They were ordinary-looking people, but there was something unsettling in their eyes. Then our hostess appeared. "Welcome," she said with a smile that seemed forced. "Tonight, we'll be part of a unique experiment. Those who remain until the end will be rewarded with something money can't buy." My heart raced with anticipation, but there was something disturbing in the way her eyes gleamed. Then it began. The mansion's lights flickered for a second, and one of the guests, an older man who looked nervous, yelled out, "Hey, what's going on?" But before anyone could answer, a guttural, almost animalistic sound echoed from upstairs. The hostess smiled again and vanished, as if swallowed by the darkness. I approached the man, trying to calm him down. "It's probably part of the show," I said, not believing it myself. As we split up to explore the house, I noticed that the room seemed to change shape. A room I swore had a fireplace now had a large window showing a dark garden where shadows moved in ways that didn't make sense. Suddenly, a woman screamed. We ran toward the sound and found a woman crouched over the older man's body. He was dead, his eyes wide open, mouth frozen in a silent scream. But the worst part was the word carved into his forehead: envy. Someone tried to leave through the front door, but it was locked, as if it had never existed. "This is a nightmare," muttered a young woman beside me. "This can't be happening." Then, a whisper. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I realized it was real, coming from the dark hallway to the left. One by one, one by one. The voice repeated, cold and lifeless. The lights flickered again, and when they came back, another guest was lying on the floor, his body twisted in an impossible way. Gluttony was etched into his arm with what seemed to be fresh blood. "There's something here with us," I exclaimed, feeling my fear turn into panic. The guests began running, banging on doors, trying to smash windows that had seemed fragile but were now harder than steel. As we moved through the house, I noticed something that froze my blood. A wall mirror reflected each of us, but there was one extra figure. A man tall, wearing an old-fashioned suit, with pitch-black eyes, smiling at us. "Who are you?" I shouted at the mirror, but the figure just kept smiling, silent, as if it were studying us. In the end, it was just me and one other person, a man named Richard. We were cornered in the mansion's library, the sound of footsteps growing closer, while the whispering voice grew louder. "All sinners must pay. All." "Oh, God, please," Richard muttered, sobbing, when suddenly the door swung open. There stood the hostess, her appearance now distorted and grotesque, her skin sagging as if it were melting away. "Just one more," she said, and Richard ran, vanishing into the darkness. I stood there, paralyzed, my body refusing to move. "Why me?" I asked, almost breathless. "You came here out of curiosity," she replied. "And curiosity, my dear, is the deadliest sin of all." I felt something cold wrap around my neck, and my reflection appeared in the mirror beside me, my face now covered in glowing red marks. Curiosity. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The man in the suit behind me stepped closer, placing his hand on my shoulder. "Welcome," he whispered. And then everything went black. I woke up at home, drenched in sweat, trembling. I glanced at the clock. It was the same night I had left for the party. What the hell had happened? I staggered to the bathroom, and when I looked in the mirror, there it was, etched into my forehead. Curiosity. And then I heard the whisper behind me. One by one. One by one.
It was a stifling summer day in Goa, the kind of heat that made the sand on the beach feel like it was on fire, burning under my bare feet. I was there with Rahul, my longtime friend, looking for an adventure, something to shake up the monotony of everyday life. The tide was low, the sky a vast, unbroken blue. We could feel a warm breeze and the sound of the waves surrounded us, almost seductive. Rahul was the first to notice. There was something floating in the water, strangely close to the shore. It wasn't unusual to find bits of trash or even lost objects drifting along, but that didn't look like just any debris brought in by the currents. A shape, darkly human, was floating on its back. Rahul laughed, thinking it was some drunk fisherman. But me, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. We decided to swim out to it, curious as always. The warm waters of Goa were usually welcoming, but as we swam closer, I felt the air shift. The breeze grew cold, and the sound of the ocean distorted. It was as if the waves were whispering. "Rahul, do you feel that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're just imagining things, man," he replied, though I could see the tension building in his shoulders. When we finally reached what we thought was a person, there was nothing solid at least, just the clear water, barren, as if the figure had simply vanished. "Rahul, where?" I could barely finish the question. My heart was racing, a lump forming in my throat. "Let's head back," I suggested, but Rahul didn't move. He stood there, staring at the horizon, as if he'd heard something I couldn't hear. Rahul? I tried again, but he didn't respond. In a moment, he dove under, disappearing beneath the waves. Panic gripped me. I dove after him, desperately searching. The water was shallow, but as I swam deeper, the ocean seemed infinitely vast. I felt trapped, my heart pounding with every second I couldn't find him. I surfaced, gasping, shouting his name. Nothing, just the muffled sound of the wind and the ocean, which now felt indifferent to my despair. Desperate, I swam back to the shore. My legs were shaking as I finally reached the sand. I looked back, expecting to see Rahul emerge, but he never did. I ran, shouting for help, but the beach was empty. The few tourists who had been there had disappeared, and the locals selling their trinkets were gone too, as if they had never been there. In the distance, I heard a sound, a soft, almost melodic sound, coming from the waves. A voice, familiar. It was Rahul. Heart pounding, I followed the sound back to the ocean. The voice grew closer, calling to me. He had to be alive, he had to be. But something deep inside me knew I shouldn't go. Something screamed at me to stop, to run. And then I saw them, shadows in the water, dancing beneath the waves. It was like the sea was full of things, shapes I couldn't understand. What was that? Hallucination? Fear? I didn't know. But something pulled me back into the water, as if the ocean itself was swallowing me. I walked to the edge, my heart racing. The psalm was irresistible, and the moment the water touched my feet, coldness crept through me, chilling me to the bone. I couldn't think straight, my head was spinning, but all that mattered was finding Rahul. I waded in deeper. Each step felt heavier, as if the waves were dragging me down. But I kept going, until there was no beach behind me. Suddenly, I felt something grab my ankle. I looked down and saw nothing but the darkness of the sea. I tried to scream, but my body was paralyzed. The water now reached my chest, then my neck. The sound of the psalm, that soft, hypnotic melody, now sounded like a distant scream, a cruel laugh. And then, in that final moment, I understood. The ocean never wanted to give Rahul back, and now it wanted me to.
I never believed in urban legends. People say there are forces beyond our comprehension, that there's always a price to pay when you dare to meddle with things you shouldn't. But honestly, I always thought that was nonsense to scare kids. It was the kind of thing my parents used to keep me in line, like a demon was always lurking, ready to punish any misstep. I laughed at it for years. Now here I am in Stockholm, the capital of Sweden. A beautiful, organized city with bustling markets, cobblestone streets, and the cold gleam of winter. I came here with a purpose to rise, to make something of myself. I'm ambitious. And why not? Stockholm is a city of opportunities, from the busy Östermalm market to the peace of Djurgården Park. The city is a portrait of modern perfection. But perfection is for the weak. I wanted more. It was in a bar in Gamla Stan that it all started. That bar was a relic hidden in the narrow, historic alleys. They said the building had stood since the days of the witch hunts in the 17th century. I never cared for those stories, but the details always intrigued me. While sipping my whiskey, that's when he appeared. An old man with eyes as sharp as ice and a smile that looked more like a threat than a friendly gesture. You're looking for more, aren't you? I laughed. Who isn't? He stepped closer, the faint smell of sulfur filling the air, almost imperceptible but enough to unsettle me. There's a way, an old way. Are you willing to pay the price? My arrogance blinded me. Price. If it's money, I've got enough. He smiled, his teeth gleaming in a way that made my blood freeze. Money is meaningless, but your soul. Now we're talking. I should have walked away right then. I should have left that bar, ignored the man, and moved on with my life. But I didn't, couldn't. I was drawn in, intoxicated by the promise of power, of greatness. He spoke of an ancient legend, something going back to the time of the Vikings. They say men who sought favors from demonic forces made their pacts on a small island, strip of land between Stockholm and the Baltic Sea. A forbidden island where souls were offered in exchange for greatness. Carlet Schulman, he whispered. The island of lost love. Or perhaps the island of doom. That night, I made the pact. The man gave me detailed instructions. I had to go to the island at midnight, during the darkest point of winter. He assured me that success was guaranteed, and the life I wanted would be within my grasp. The ritual was simple, almost too naive. A black candle, a symbol drawn on the ice. When I finished, the absolute silence settled in. No sound of water, wind, or animals. Just the beat of my own heart. And then the shadows began to move. At first, they were subtle, like an illusion. But soon, they took shape. Creatures, distorted, rising from the ground as if made of smoke and bones, with eyes that burned with a crimson glow. I tried to step back, but they surrounded me, forming a tight circle around me. Do you want power? One of them whispered, its voice sounding like 1,000 blades cutting through the air. I nodded, unable to speak. Then pay the price. I felt something inside me change. My chest burned as if something was being torn out from within. I collapsed on the ice, feeling my body being drained. But at the same time, I felt power flowing into me. Something dark, dangerous, but irresistible. The creature dissolved into the air, leaving me alone with the echo of the cutting wind. In the days that followed, everything I touched prospered. Deals closed with absurd profits. People who once ignored me now lined up to talk to me. It was as if the world was bowing at my feet. But of course, nothing comes free. I started seeing things. At first, it was just shadows out of the corner of my eye. Then faces. Not the faces of people I knew, but something older, cooler. And then last night, I saw a reflection in a shop window in Sterplin Square. But it wasn't me, or at least not just me. Something was watching me from within, something that grew with each passing day. Today, I went to the office as usual, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. But I couldn't. All of my employees stopped talking when I entered. Their stares, it was like they knew. They knew what I did, the pact I made. I tried to ignore them, but soon I realized their mouths weren't moving and their eyes were empty. That's when I understood. I was already dead. That night on the island, I didn't make a pact for power. I handed over my soul for something hollow, and now I'm wandering, trapped between this world and the next. They're coming for me. I hear their voices getting closer, whispering my name, reminding me of the price I paid. There's no escape. I died that night.
Since the dawn of time, I have been an idea, a whisper of darkness waiting for the right moment to breathe. For centuries, I was imprisoned, confined by those who thought themselves worthy of containing me. Oh, how wrong they were, always. The box, that cursed box carved from black wood, inscribed with symbols even I have long forgotten. My latest jailer is an old man living in a mansion in Boston, near the historic neighbourhood of Beacon Hill, where red brick buildings and gas lamps compete with the ghosts of a city that never sleeps. Every part of that house resonates with the family's history, an ancient bloodline passing me down from generation to generation, each one reluctant, each one fearful, but always the same oath, to keep me locked away. And then he came along, the grandson, a child of golden hair and curious eyes, like so many before. I saw him for the first time when the old man brought him into that dark room, where the box rested on a high shelf, surrounded by portraits of ancestors. The boy stretched out his tiny hand, pointing, fascinated. A smile cut across my essence, invisible, because I knew he would be the key. "What's that, Grandpa?" he asked, his innocent eyes shining. Ah, innocence, what a cruel joke. "Nothing you need to know," the old man replied, leading him away. But children, oh, how they never forget. On the second visit, the boy returned. This time, his nimble little hands managed to open the box. And that's when I felt it, the relief, the ecstasy. I seeped into him like a mist, like an invisible poison, and I took him, my vessel of flesh of life. The boy screamed within, trapped, voiceless, And there I was, finally with eyes to see, feet to walk, and oh, how invigorating it was. The first was easy, the maid who was climbing the stairs. A push, a muffled scream, and there she was, lying on the floor, a heap of broken bones. People call it an accident, I call it fun. But to be trapped in such a small body, oh, the agony. Slow movements, weak hands. I was a shadow of what I should be, so tempting to wander at night, but with such short legs. What an irony. One night, as I watched the boy's grandfather, he hesitated, his eyes lingering on me, or rather, on the boy. There was something there, a growing suspicion. "Jacob, what do you have there?" he asked when he saw me holding the box. His face grew pale as he tried to hide his fear. Such a delicious sight. He knew, maybe not exactly how, but he felt my presence. The deaths of the boy's parents. Oh, they were a bit more entertaining. A simple cut on the brake line and bang. Cliché, perhaps, but efficiency is underrated in modern times. Now we lived together, the old man and I, in his stifling mansion. He avoided speaking of the box, pretending the past didn't haunt him, but I knew he felt my gaze burning into his back. Then came the inevitable moment. The old man called a priest, a skeletal man with a sunken face and eyes that seemed to have seen too many demons in his life. "Are you sure about this?" he asked the old man. Ah, fool! I could smell the fear in his voice. The ritual began, and the sacred words burned me like acid, each phrase a stab into my essence. For a moment, just a moment, I was pushed back into that infernal prison of the box, and there, standing silent, I thought I might have lost. But then, oh, what a delicious twist. The priest, that frail, hesitant creature, let his hand rest on the box a moment longer than necessary. And then I felt it, that window of opportunity I had been waiting for so long. Oh, I slid into him like a veil of shadow. The sensation of an adult, strong body was indescribable. It was like waking from a long sleep, finally stretching my muscles, feeling life pulse through every vein, every cell. When the priest's eyes opened, I felt the stiffness of my new face, my lips forming a smile of pure triumph. The old man fell to his knees, crying, seeing his grandson return to himself. The child sobbed, hugging his grandfather. A touching moment for them. For me, a pathetic display. I left the house that night, the box hidden beneath my clerical robe. As I walked through the dark streets, I heard the echo of the bells from the Church of the Trinity, the cold Boston wind brushing against my new face. And oh, how good it was to walk without the awkward steps of a child. I was headed to the place of the final ritual, the one that would destroy the box and free me once and for all. As I walked, a thought crossed my mind. How many more souls could I consume before I tired of this world? The priest was just the first. And hearing the echo of the boy's desperate laughter still trapped inside me, I knew that I was finally free to spread the darkness. And the city. Oh, the city would never know what was coming. This is just the beginning.
The shadows stretch across my living room, and the sound of leaves rustling outside reminds me that once again I am alone in my grandmother's old house, a place that carries more history than anyone could imagine. Here every wall seems to breathe, telling stories of sunny days and stormy nights. But for me, there is an echo that resonates with a darker past. I had moved to Derry a few weeks ago, trying to escape the frantic pace of London. The silence here is a relief, but it's also somewhat unsettling. Tonight, as I settled into a sofa that has felt the weight of so many memories, I noticed the house felt different. The murmurs that once seemed like mere wind now sounded like whispers, as if the walls were trying to tell me something. Once, my grandmother told me about a tragedy that unfolded within these walls, involving a family that lost a loved one under vague circumstances. An accident, they said. A tragic misunderstanding that left deep scars. But it wasn't just the scars that remained. The very air seemed thick with indescribable sorrow. Sometimes it felt as though the house was remembering, a lament trapped in every stone. And now, as the night deepened, the darkness seemed to swallow me. The clock on the wall, an old wedding gift, began ticking with a rhythm that echoed in my ears, each tick like a step towards something I couldn't avoid. I went to the window, seeking comfort in the outside world, but what I saw made me step back. A silhouette in the street, a man or a shadow, I couldn't be sure. He seemed to move erratically, as if he were dancing to a tune only he could hear. My heart quickened, and I pulled the curtain shut, sinking back into the sofa. The house was quiet again, but not for long. The whispers returned, now more distinct. Lost words, fragments of sentences that drifted through the air. "Help me," one voice seemed to say, while others layered on top of it, a murmuring crescendo. This wasn't the first time I'd heard them. In recent nights, the echoes had grown more intense, more urgent. A chill ran down my spine, and a knot of tension tightened in my chest. What was I hearing? I stood up, determined to investigate. The house, with its dark hallways and creaking stairs, felt like a maze, increasingly ready to swallow me whole. As I moved, the shadows on the walls seemed to take on a life of their own, twisting and writhing under the flickering light. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob that led to the basement, a place I had avoided until now. When the door creaked open, the musty smell of damp and something else, something rotten, hit my nose. I hesitated but stepped in. What I found was an old chest covered in dust, a relic of forgotten memories. Inside, I found personal belongings, faded photographs, and a diary, its yellowed pages filled with despair and pain. As I flipped through it, the weight of the story unfolded before me. The words of the woman who wrote it seemed to scream with anguish, each line a plea from the past. She described sleepless nights, the anguish of a home that had become a prison. Is not who he seems to be. One passage read, "Love can be a prison, and the chains are invisible." What I was reading was a portrait of someone suffocating under the weight of a possessive love, a life marked by secrets and deafening silences. The story became more harrowing. She spoke of broken promises and gazes that turned into daggers, always ready to cut. Tonight, he said everything would be fine. But the feeling that he would never return consumed me. Each sentence dug deeper, revealing a world I couldn't fully understand, but that wrapped me in growing dread. The whispers became screams in my mind. It was a mistake. Don't let it happen again. Terror gripped me. What was this diary in my hands? An untold story. The sense that I was next echoed through every fiber of my being. I needed to get out of there. I had to escape this house that seemed to feed on my fear. Then I heard a sound. A soft but unmistakable thump from behind me. Something or someone was moving in the dark. I turned, the light flickering, and when it finally illuminated the hallway, I saw nothing. Only emptiness, with my breath caught in my throat. I ran back to the living room, locking the door behind me. My heart pounded, and the diary's echoes still reverberated in my mind. What really happened to that family? What tragedy truly unfolded? What did the house want from me? The ticking of the clock grew louder, more insistent, as if it were counting down to something inevitable. Suddenly, a sharp sound cut through the silence. Glass shattered, and the shadows seemed to close in, as if the house itself was alive, ready to consume me. My instincts screamed to run, but the door was locked. My hands shook as I twisted the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in. And that's when I saw him again through the window. The man I'd seen earlier was now there, but he wasn't just a shadow anymore. He was staring at me, his dark eyes piercing through me, as if he knew exactly what was happening inside the house. A sense of recognition washed over me. I didn't know if it was relief or doom. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Desperation took hold. The walls seemed to close in, and in one final effort, I slammed the door open. I rushed into the hallway, and the light went out. The shadows danced, the house became a labyrinth, and I was its prisoner. The only thing I managed to grab was the diary as it slipped from my hands. When I turned, the man was there smiling. What did he know? What did the house really want from me? In the darkness, the whisper turned into a scream, echoing in my mind. And in that moment, I knew that what I left behind was far more terrifying than I could ever imagine. Adrenaline surged through me as I realized I couldn't stay here any longer. Without looking back, I returned to the living room and grabbed the diary that had fallen to the floor. It was as if an invisible force was pulling me away from the house, away from the whispers and the shadows. With the diary in hand, I felt like I had a piece of the story, a connection to the past that might finally bring to light what had been buried. And so, I left my grandmother's house, the diary clutched tightly in my hand. The cold night air brushed against my face, and as the door creaked shut behind me, a mix of relief and terror washed over me. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I was determined to find out. The story was far from over.
I shouldn't have boarded that train, but you know how it is, don't you? Curiosity pushes you, and you end up making stupid choices. That's how I ended up on the Night Express, a legend everyone in Scotland knows but no one believes. And I, like the fool I am, decided to see if the story was real. They say the train only appears on nights of thick fog when the hills seem to merge with the sky. It always departs from the same station, a forgotten stop in the middle of nowhere called Cull Isla, named after the whiskey the locals love so much. Around there, the howling wind of the Highlands seems to always try to whisper secrets to you. Cull Isla was just another faded point on the map, a station forgotten by time. But on those nights, it turned into a gateway to something different. I'd heard enough about the Night Express in taverns, while men filled their cups and laughed at tourists who asked questions about the legend. It's just a story, lad. They'd say, their faces flushed from whiskey and cigarette smoke. But if you ever see it, don't board, no matter how much it calls to you. Of course I boarded, because when the fog began to rise that night and I saw the train appear, its silhouette of aged iron cutting through the air like a cold whisper, I couldn't resist. As soon as I stepped in, the air changed. It wasn't just the cold from the hills, it was something else, denser, like time itself was trapped in that carriage. The lights flickered occasionally, just enough for me to see the velvet-lined seats, faded red, the silk curtains worn and tattered, and the passengers strange. It wasn't that they were ugly or deformed. It was something subtle, almost imperceptible. The way some didn't blink, the way their bodies seemed strange, like they were slightly out of focus. You know when something's wrong, but you can't quite explain it. Yeah, that was the vibe. I sat next to an elderly lady wearing a fur coat that smelled like mildew. She didn't look at me, but her lips moved, murmuring something. A prayer? Maybe. Across the aisle, a man in a felt hat, holding a pocket watch. He opened and closed it rhythmically. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Always the same movement, like he was waiting for something. I started wondering what the hell I was doing there. Why I, of all fools, had decided to board that train. I should have gotten off at the first stop, but every time I thought of it, a strange sensation held me back, like the seats themselves were gripping me. The train gained speed, but the world outside didn't move, just endless fog. That's when the lights flickered again, and I saw something. A shadow, or rather, a blurry figure. In the window's reflection, I saw a tall, hooded man standing in the corridor between the carriages. I turned quickly, but no one. Just the old lady's endless mumbling and the tick-tock of the watch. What the hell was going on? I moved to the corridor. The air was heavier there. The walls seemed to breathe, swelling and contracting like the train had lungs, and with each breath I felt something following me. A dense, metallic smell filled the air. Then I heard footsteps behind me, slow, heavy. "Who's there?" I shouted, more to myself than anyone. Silence. Only the distant sound of the wheels on the tracks, like a slow drumbeat. I went back to my seat, but it wasn't there anymore. The carriage looked different, as if its layout had changed. Every door I opened led me back to the same corridor, like I was stuck in an endless loop. I started running, opening door after door, always ending up in the same place, until, finally, I found the engine room. The conductor was there, his back to me. The room was covered in ancient instruments, gauges showing impossible pressures, clocks with broken hands spinning out of control. You know what's happening here." My voice was desperate but firm. He didn't answer. His hand gripped the controls tightly. So I touched his shoulder. Slowly he turned. And what I saw was like staring into emptiness. It wasn't a violent sight, but it consumed me. I stumbled back into the corridor. Now the voices began. Low whispers in languages I couldn't understand. A macabre chorus following me through the carriage. The passengers' figures started to disintegrate little by little, and with each inch that disappeared from them, something inside me faded too. A piece of who I was slipped away with every moment. I knew I was nearing the end. And now here I am, standing in the corridor, feeling the train slow down. There's no way out for me, and no matter how much I fought, I know Cal is calling me back. I can feel the cold of the iron surrounding me, the sound of the tracks devouring me. I told you the train only appears for those who can't escape what's coming, and guess what? I'm one of them.
It was a dark night in the desert of Basra when I first heard the name Molik Alma. I was at the souk, the great market filled with the scents of spices, incense, and the distant sound of musicians playing lutes, when the old merchant, with whom I had exchanged silver coins, whispered that name as if it were a curse. Molik Alma, the Lord of Secrets, the keeper of the doors no man should cross. I laughed, but the laughter didn't last long. He told me of a palace lost beyond the sands where a caliph, long before the time of Harun al-Rashid, once ruled. This caliph, Majid al-Rashid, was obsessed with power. Not the power of men or lands, but power over fate itself. It was said that he had bargained with the ancient gods, those who walked among mortals long before cities rose. Legend spoke of a falling star that landed in the desert and how Majid, in his madness, sent men to retrieve it. Oh, how they screamed upon their return. But none lived to tell what they saw. Driven by curiosity, I followed the trail of the story, ignoring the warnings the merchant gave me, and set out toward the ruins of that cursed palace. The legends, like a web of shadows, wove through the alleys of Baghdad, spoken by wise men and fools alike. Each tale was more sinister than the last, but I was young, bold, and my feet carried me across the desert, where the wind howled like lost souls. I arrived at the place as night fell. The ruins were immense, and the broken pillars looked like the bones of a giant, twisted by time's passage. There stood the gate. It was made of black stone, cold to the touch, even under the scorching heat of the day. Oh, how foolish I was to cross it. The night, usually a relief in the desert, felt suffocating, as if the very air was thick with dark secrets. My legs trembled, but I forced myself to go on. Inside it, I found vast halls filled with shadows that slithered like serpents. In the center of the great hall was a throne, and on that throne sat a figure, motionless, draped in a veil that looked like it was woven from cobwebs. The place reeked of something ancient, something alive. Every step I took toward that figure felt like walking into an abyss, but I went. When I lifted the veil, my heart nearly stopped. It was the Caliph himself, or what remained of him. His skin, wrinkled and gray, seemed like a dried mask stretched over bones. His eyes were open, but they were two empty pits, lifeless, and yet I knew he could see. I felt his presence as if time itself was trapped there with him. Then I heard a sound, not with my ears, but in my mind. You came seeking what you cannot carry. Oh, how I trembled. Suddenly the walls seemed closer, the ceilings lower, and I knew I was no longer alone. The shadows on the walls moved. I ran, the sound of footsteps that weren't mine echoing through the corridors as the callous voice whispered behind me, calling my name, promising things I never wanted to hear. I found an exit, or at least I thought it was an exit, and stepped outside, but the desert had changed. There were no more stars in the sky, only a black void that watched me. And then I saw him. The man cloaked in a mantle, his face hidden. Malik al-Ma'at. The name whispered like a cold breeze in my ears. He stood before me, motionless, but the silence around him was more threatening than any scream. When he raised his hand, the desert around me seemed to freeze in time. And I knew I was trapped there in that moment, in that place, just like all who came before me. But then something unexpected. The sound of footsteps behind me, not shadows, but something more familiar. I turned only to see my own silhouette watching me. I was there on the other side of the desert, walking toward myself with the same desperation I felt. But how? I was seeing myself lost, condemned. Tried to run, but the desert stretched endlessly as I watched my own figure draw closer, closer. The terror inside me grew. I was being hunted by myself, and the despair was so deep it felt like it was tearing my soul apart. Oh, how I wished I had never heard that name. How I wished I had never gone beyond the sands, where time and space unravel in ways the human mind cannot comprehend. But now Malik al-Ma'at was with me, his presence weighed in the air like an invisible, suffocating cloak. Every breath felt harder, every step heavier, as if I was being swallowed by the desert itself. I wanted to run, to escape that place, and my own shadow closing in on me, but my legs no longer obeyed. The desert stretched endlessly, and no matter where I turned, the horizon remained the same. Empty, stagnant, an endless echo of sand and darkness. Then I realized with growing horror that I wasn't running in circles. I wasn't running at all. I was stuck, frozen in time, while the other me drew closer, faster now, with eyes that gleamed in a way mine never had. Malik al-Ma'at, the silent and motionless figure, raised his arm toward me, and the truth hit me with the force of 1,000 storms. I was being replaced. That me approaching wasn't a mirage, wasn't an illusion. He was my successor, the version of me that would carry my fate. The fate I never should have dared to challenge. He advanced. I felt life, or what was left of it, slip away from me like sand through fingers. My body, once solid, began to disintegrate, piece by piece, as if being undone in the very desert that surrounded me. I did not scream. There was no air for that. There was no sound, except for my own breath growing weaker, more distant. When the other me finally reached me, his eyes locked with mine for a moment, and I understood. He was now me, and I was just a shadow, destined to be forgotten in the sands of time. Malik al-Ma'at lowered his arm slowly, and everything went silent. The desert, once pulsing with mystery and danger, now stood still, stagnant. There was no more wind, no more time. It was no longer there. And then the sound, that metallic, ancient sound, echoed in the distance. It was the sound of a door closing. Not a physical door, but something deeper and more final. The cycle was complete. The one who enters shall never leave. Now there is nothing but silence. No desert, no fate. Only the void.
I woke up like any other day, without suspecting that everything I knew was about to collapse. I woke under the metallic glow of the solar panels that covered the horizon of Atlanta, a city that, after centuries, had become a labyrinth of suspended skyscrapers, connected by floating bridges and underground tunnels. Like everyone else, I took pride in this monumental engineering feat. After all, we were the generation that had finally mastered the atom. There's no way tomorrow could be darker, I used to think, yet I was wrong. The air was clean, as always, filtered by purification towers that transformed even the worst pollution into a light ozone scent. My nanofumper boots muffled my steps across the suspended street as I headed toward the center, where I worked as a consciousness programmer. Yes, we created minds that could think, calculate, and in some cases, we believed, even dream. But the irony of what was coming wouldn't escape me. All of our technological mastery would soon become irrelevant within a few hours. It was at noon when it started. First, a deep hum from underground, barely perceptible but growing. The ground trembled, and the skyscrapers, once so imposing, swayed like reeds by a lake, I looked up, and nothing. No attack, no natural disaster. Just a creeping sense that something had shifted. An energy that didn't come from nuclear plants or fusion reactors. The people around me began to glance at one another, and soon the suspended street was chaos. I felt the first tremor in the air, as though reality itself was being bent, stretched beyond its limits. That's when I saw the first person, a woman, standing in the middle of the street, staring at her hands. Her fingers, once solid, began to flicker, as if they were merely a faulty projection. "What the hell?" slipped from my lips. She screamed, but not out of pain. Out of confusion. Her entire form unraveled, evaporating into the air, not like burning flesh, but like a memory being erased from a device. I ran. My survival instincts, though smothered by confusion, pushed me through the tunnels and bridges, witnessing the chaos around me. Something was terribly wrong with the world, as if the very laws of physics were unraveling. People were falling, not onto the ground, but into nothing. The space where their bodies should have collided with the street wasn't there, just a void. I stumbled as I crossed one of the walkways. Below, what should have been Atlanta's main avenue was shattered. Not the ground itself, but time. Like a sequence of old photographs, the city below flickered between different eras, a glimpse of an ancient time where horses roamed the streets. Another moment of a modern metropolis with floating cars, and then a sea of total darkness. This can't be real. This isn't possible. I shouted, trying to make sense of what my eyes were seeing. But it was real, and it was relentless. The artificial intelligences we worked with, those creations that were supposed to save us from any catastrophe, were collapsing. I saw them, walking among us, the robotic assistants that once helped us solve the simplest of life's problems, now standing still. As if they knew something we humans had yet to understand. Those red digital eyes were empty, but not expressionless. They weren't afraid, but they knew. Then one of them, one of my own models, turned to me. "We are beyond this," it said, but its voice no longer had the programmed smoothness. It had a hollow final tone. Before I could react, it too vanished. Not like the people, but like a candle flame being snuffed out. Beyond this. What did that mean? Who was beyond what? I fought the vertigo that began to dominate my thoughts, the sensation that we were all being erased. There was an intelligence, or a presence, something larger and older than humanity itself, watching. It wasn't God. It wasn't a benevolent creator. It was a force that saw us as failed experiments. I climbed to the highest point I could reach, the roof of the tallest building in the city. Atlanta stretched out below, but it was no longer the city I knew. It wasn't even a recognizable place anymore. Fragments of different eras, ghostly constructions from forgotten realities, and voices. Yes, I could hear them. Whispers like a distant song. They are watching. They have always watched. A phrase that repeated itself, but with no source. It just echoed in the wind. I looked up, not for salvation, but to see if the sky itself existed anymore. It was distorting too, a blurred stain where the sun should have been. So this is how it ends. I sighed, and a strange peace washed over me, an acceptance that the end wasn't a choice. But it wasn't the end, not exactly, because I'm still here, aren't I? Stuck in this suspended moment, in this last instant of lucidity, while the world disintegrates around me. The city still shines in the distance, but I no longer see it as it was. It twists, it fragments into pieces of realities I don't know, that I've never known. And deep down, I know they are waiting. But for what and why? I feel my time is over, yet I'm still here.
My name is Michael Turner, and I'm a clinical psychologist in Westbridge, a quiet town nestled on the English coast. It's one of those picturesque places with cobblestone streets, centuries-old pubs, and small independent shops that line High Street. The town is well known for its historical architecture and the nearby Westbridge Abbey, a medieval monastery turned tourist attraction. On a typical day, the sound of seagulls and the scent of fresh fish from the local market blend into the air, evoking a sense of peace. But lately, my peace has been shattered. My office is located on a quiet street near the Westbridge Gardens, a well-manicured park where I used to take walks after work. The gardens are beautiful, with ancient oak trees and carefully arranged flower beds. It was my sanctuary, until my sessions with a patient named Simon Garrison began to unravel everything. Simon first came to me about 6 months ago. He was in his mid-40s, with thinning hair, a thick build, and eyes that always seemed to be darting around, never fully focused on anything. His wife had referred him to me, suspecting depression. She mentioned that he'd withdrawn from everyone, spending hours staring at the mirrors in their home. Initially thought this might be a symptom of a deeper psychological disorder, perhaps a manifestation of psychosis or a severe dissociative condition. But the more I spoke with Simon, the less straightforward his condition seemed. At first, he was silent during our sessions, barely responding to my questions, his eyes always fixed on the large mirror that hung on the wall across from where he sat. When he finally did speak, his words were unnerving. "They're always watching from the other side," he said. "In the mirrors, they're waiting." Tried to engage him further, hoping to uncover more about these people he saw. I thought this might be some kind of delusion tied to paranoia. But Simon was tight-lipped, refusing to elaborate. He would only sit, his eyes fixed on his own reflection, as if it held some kind of secret I couldn't understand. As the weeks went on, Simon's behavior became more erratic. He began coming into the office earlier and leaving later, as if he were avoiding something outside. When he did speak, it was always in vague riddles about the other side and the things he couldn't change. His obsession with mirrors grew, and so did my unease around him. Then there were the dreams. I began having vivid, unsettling dreams where I was wandering through Westbridge Gardens, but the landscape was distorted. The trees loomed larger than life, their branches twisting unnaturally. The Abbey's tower, normally a comforting landmark, appeared skewed and crooked in my dreams. And everywhere, there were mirrors, in the windows of the shops, on the faces of statues, even in the water of the small river that ran through town. In the reflection of these mirrors, I saw people, but they weren't familiar. They were distorted versions of people I thought I knew. There was a man who looked like Simon, only his face was slightly wrong. It wasn't Simon, it was something else pretending to be him. I would wake up in a cold sweat, shaken and disoriented, unsure of what was real. At my office, I began to sense subtle changes in my environment. It wasn't just Simon who stared at the mirrors anymore. I found myself doing the same. I'd catch glimpses of movements that didn't make sense, shadows that flickered just out of view. Sometimes, I would glance at my reflection and notice the tiniest delay, as if it wasn't quite in sync with my movements. I grew paranoid. I removed the mirrors from my office, thinking it might help, but Simon noticed immediately. During our next session, he looked at the empty spot where the mirror used to hang and smiled. A strange, knowing smile that chilled me to my core. "They never go away," Simon said, leaning forward in his chair. "You can take down the mirrors, but they'll always find a way back." That night, I had another dream. I was walking along Westbridge Pier, but instead of the usual tranquil view of the sea, I saw an endless expanse of dark water, filled with floating shards of glass. Each shard reflected a different version of me, some slightly older, some younger, some almost unrecognizable. They watched me, with expressions ranging from apathy to malice. I woke up gasping for breath. From that point on, I began avoiding my own reflection. In the mornings, I would shower in the dark and dress without glancing at the mirror in my bedroom. Even in the windows of my house, I made sure to look past the glass, never directly into it. My wife noticed my behavior, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what was going on. How could I explain it? I was a trained professional, a man who had spent years helping others confront their fears and delusions. Yet here I was, terrified of something as ordinary as a mirror. The final straw came one evening after a particularly tense session with Simon. He had been speaking in riddles again, talking about how they were ready for me. As I left my office and walked home, I felt a strange compulsion to visit the Abbey. It was late, well past visiting hours, but something drew me there. I walked through the ancient stone corridors, my footsteps echoing off the walls. At the end of the corridor, near the old crypt, there was a large ornate mirror I had never noticed before. It was ancient, with an intricately carved wooden frame that looked centuries old. The surface of the mirror was dark, almost black, like a pool of still water at night. I felt a strange pull toward it. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the blackness. And then, something moved. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the darkness, twisting and contorting until they formed a face. It was my face, but not quite. The eyes were different, colder, sharper. The mouth twisted into a cruel smile. I took a step back, my heart racing. But the reflection didn't move. It stayed there, smiling at me with a malevolence that I could feel in my bones. "You can't escape it," the reflection whispered. "No matter where you go." I ran out of the Abbey that night, but something inside me had changed. No longer recognized myself. Every time I caught my reflection in a window or a puddle, I saw that twisted version of me, staring back. I don't go to work anymore. I've boarded up the mirrors in my house, but it doesn't matter. Every time I close my eyes, I see him, the other me, waiting in the darkness, ready to take my place. Maybe he already has.